It's the week ending Saturday, the 28th of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped, brought to you by Barclays Corporate Banking. In the past 7 days, we've seen Pakistan's governing party rejecting the election of their rivals, wildfires in Athens killing dozens, and the US and the EU narrowly avoiding a trade war. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Ollie Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Holly Clements, Holden Frith and Arian McNichol, who is starting the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we realised why you should never tweet first and ask questions later.
Because I think he made some good movies and he was making some bad jokes that were years ago. I don't think he should be fired now for that when his employer knew very well that those tweets existed back then.
What do you think about the tweets?
I think they were terrible.
Right.
Yeah, they weren't funny.
Yeah, do you guys want to read some of the tweets here?
They were
No, I
terrible.
actually know what they are, but I disagree with you, right? Because right now we're holding everybody else accountable for something they did 15 years ago, but we're going to give this guy a pass because he directs good movies.
That's a good point.
So, these are awful. The things that the president's saying is awful and all these other people, but it's like if one's accountable, they all need to be accountable.
That was InfoWars' Savannah Hernandez getting the public reaction to the news that James Gunn was fired this week for offensive tweets published in 2011. Now, Arian, this news was quite big amongst the Twitterati, I guess, for want of a better phrase, but for those of us who don't get all our news from social media, recap what happened.
So James Gunn is a Hollywood director. He was the director of the Guardians of the Galaxy films, among other Disney projects, and he was fired by Disney after old tweets of his resurfaced where he was saying various fairly on-edge jokes, if not completely horrible. Some of them were about rape, some of them were about incest and paedophilia, and Disney caught up with those and fired him. Simultaneously, or in fact a couple of days later, Dan Harmon, who's the co-creator of Rick and Morty, a popular sort of adult animation show, quit Twitter and sent out a pretty serious and all-encompassing apology after an old piece of work of his also resurfaced. It was a sketch that he had produced for a now-defunct TV show where he was playing a character who was molesting babies. Then a couple of days later, Trevor Noah began facing a backlash of his own after some old jokes of his resurfaced. These were about Aboriginal women. He'd said that Australian Aboriginal women were ugly, pretty much. That's kind of the crux of what the humour was, if it's humour. And he's got a show coming up in Australia, and so there's a big campaign underway to boycott his show.
Okay, so numerous cases of people in the public eye in Hollywood getting done over for things they wrote or said in the past in jest.
Yep.
This trend, though, isn't as straightforward as that, is it? Because the reason most of these came to light, I mean, the clip we played was from InfoWars, which is a notorious right-wing channel fronted by Alex Jones. The reason these came to light is a campaign by the alt-right as well.
That's what some people have said. It's not entirely clear that that's that's what you said and various other people as well. It's not clear that is totally the case. Certainly the Dan Harmon clip first showed up on 4chan.
Which is a web forum staffed by people who are into memes and politics.
Yeah, and there is a lot of alt-right stuff there. James Gunn's tweets that resurfaced, that did look like it was a hit job by a conservative website called The Daily Caller. So there are connections, and, obviously Trevor Noah is very anti-Trump, and so there is a through line that can be created, but I don't know that you can necessarily say that it was a targeted attack.
But the argument goes the high-profile alt-right scalp was Roseanne, as discussed on this show just last week, actually, right? And so this is possibly revenge. If you're going to say Roseanne tweeted something racist, therefore she gets to lose her job, then other people that are being employed by big Hollywood companies should lose their job too for things they said that aren't politically correct. Should they, Holden Frith?
I don't think they should, actually. I would even go so far as to say I probably wouldn't have fired Roseanne. I think that there does seem to be an immediate reaction to any of these sorts of transgressions, which is either you have to defend that person to the hilt or you have to fire them and banish them and never speak of them again. And actually, I think more often the correct response is that you criticize the person, you expose them to ridicule or some sort of consequence, whether that's an apology and I don't know, maybe some contribution to charity or some sort of penance, but then give them a second chance, let them go on with doing what they're doing. I think that part of this is less about politics than economics. The fact that Disney was involved in the firings of both James Gunn and Roseanne Barr feels as if they're just very nervous, as I'm sure a lot of big companies are, about ending up on the end of a backlash or a boycott. And that's not really good for entertainment if people are sort of that risk averse and that nervous about how things are going to land.
Well, it seems, Holly, that Disney, would accept criticism that they're being hypocritical by having someone front a family sitcom or direct a family movie who said things, as Holden suggests, in a more mature, sophisticated society, we might say, well, their Twitter profile is their unfiltered, provocative views. That's nothing to do with the work that they make elsewhere. But Disney have accepted the accusation. It's hypocritical to put out something with their name on it if people think, well, their real view is something completely contrary. So is that right?
I think maybe the difference between Roseanne and James Gunn is that his was in the past and something he's apologised for, and quite a wholesome apology that I think most of his fans accept. Roseanne's still current. She's still putting those tweets out at the moment. It's not something that happened in the past that she's particularly apologetic for. There's also a weird paradox as it comes in a Trump era, yet the president of America has said the most hideous things in the past and nobody bats an eyelid. He hasn't faced any consequences. And if that sort of thing, if James Gunn had said some of the comments that he said about women, I won't use the P word on our podcast, but if that had happened to him, maybe people would have reacted with firings, but yet he's
And the
allowed to
context
carry
is
on.
different as well, because, I know Trump says in that example you give, locker room banter didn't really mean it, but on the face of it at the time, he did mean it. He was bragging about something that he'd done. James Gunn, the tweets, I don't want to say any of them here because they are very bad taste, and they are jokes about molesting babies. They're not funny, but they're clearly bad taste jokes. You could even make a rationale for them by saying, by raising this bad taste issue of paedophilia, I'm confronting people with a horrible truth in humour. He's not saying I actually rape babies, whereas Trump was saying I grope women.
James Gunn's actually come out and said that I haven't acted on any of these things, as if he has to say that.
Yeah.
But where do you draw the line? Ricky Gervais says some really controversial jokes, but everyone just laughs and praises him, and he gets a DVD made of his comedy. It's not coming back to bite him.
The paedophilia thing in particular, rightly, is now something that people understand, scars people's lives and creates trauma for generations and needs to be talked about seriously. However, as someone who went to stand-up a lot 10, 15 years ago, I'd go as far to say it was ubiquitous. Everyone was making pedo jokes. That was your standard late-night opener. And so it's hypocritical, isn't it, to look at a tweet from 10 years ago and say, oh dear, a bit close to the knuckle.
And I think also comedy deals in the risque, the edgy, and the minute you start to try to shut that stuff down, then you do create a problem for comedy broadly. I think we do also live in quite a censorious age where people are very cautious about what they joke about, and sometimes rightly so. But I think it's fascinating to watch the speed at which humour is dating and things that used to be funny suddenly becoming entirely taboo. And as there's countless websites dedicated to the films and comedies in particular that could no longer be made because they violate current conventions of attitudes to race, sex, sexuality, and so on.
Yeah, one's reminded of the millennial reaction to Friends when it resurfaced on Netflix, which was the biggest TV show of the 90s, as being homophobic and racist.
That sort of trend is encouraged by social media as well, because it does tend to be the loudest and most extreme voices that get the most attention, and because there's just not that much space for nuance. And that has coincided, or perhaps it's not a coincidence, but it has come at the same time as the rise of Trump, and that sort of very tribal, polarized approach to almost anything, really, where everything has to be either 100% good or 100% bad. Whereas actually it may be that...
Sad as well. Get sad.
Yeah, and fake. But it may be that Trevor Noah is 90% funny and charming and 10% cruel and unfunny, and that may be a pretty good ratio. But it's just...
The reverse for Jimmy Carr.
Well, this is it. It's subjective, isn't it? And I saw the Trevor Noah routine, and I think the mechanic that he was using to get to the punchline was bad taste and something he shouldn't have said. But there was a mechanic, but there was a punchline, which, again, difficult to say on the show, was about filleting a didgeridoo, which arguably, as a comedian, I can sort of understand why he would, he's come up with a punchline, and how do I get there? And this is 4 or 5 years later. And it's not inconsistent, is it, for him to say, I now regret doing that, but at the time it felt like a reasonable thing to do. And it's revisionism to say it didn't happen.
Yeah. And his apology as Holly was suggesting in the other cases too, Trevor Noah's apology was graceful and felt sincere and did come with a commitment not to do it again, which is different from the attitude you would see in Roseanne Barr's Twitter feed.
But Holly, do you now think, right, I'm going to go back through all my social media, anything that's older than a year, because people will expect me to stand by what I said when I was 19?
I did. As we were looking through this, researching the topic, I thought, what have I said? And I hopefully haven't said anything too offensive. But yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? And I think that for comedians, it's a tricky process because they used to go around with small gigs trying out their jokes with a small crowd thinking if this doesn't work, this is offensive, people don't like it, I'll just never say it again. Everyone's got smartphones now, so you say one thing out of place and you're suddenly out of the community. You can't make a film, you can't be on Twitter.
I'd be interested to know your answer to that question actually, Ollie. Did it make you go back and look at your your body of work and reconsider anything?
Well, it's interesting as a podcaster because I've got an audio trail that goes back over a decade now where I made bad taste and politically incorrect jokes. And actually, you can't read. There's not a transcription of those jokes, so I'd have to literally listen back to everything and decide what should or shouldn't be on my podcast feed. And my view is that my audience are mature enough to understand that things are in context and I've changed and developed as a person. And what's interesting with James Gunn is clearly his audience are too. The problem is Disney feel where it's not just his audience, they have to watch the movie. And that's where you have the issue, isn't it? People who actually like you as a person quite like it if you're quite honest about the fact that, you said something 5 years ago that now you think is racist and you shouldn't have said.
An interesting distinction there between podcasting and social media as well, where podcasting, the drawbacks of it is it's quite hard to discover new and podcasts outside your circle. But the flip side of that is that you consume it as a whole unit and often actually as a whole body of work. And if you find one you like, you go back through. And so you're always seeing comments within context, whereas social media tends to take comments out of context and you just see one tweet, and it might be that the tweets before and after that led you to understand that as irony or to see it within the context of a much broader picture, whereas if you just see that one offence, it strikes you in quite a different way.
So what is the answer, Holly? Are you going back and deleting anything?
I didn't find anything. I'm an angel.
Well, you're next. What do you think this week will be remembered for? It's got to be something you will never regret in the future.
Is it time to go back to black?
I always say at the very beginning of my service, this is a sad time and it's right and proper that we should express our sadness. I mean, I did do one funeral when, as we were going out, the Morecambe and Wise Bring Me Sunshine was playing because everybody who knew the person could picture Dad doing the Morecambe and Wise, hop out, and that helped them get out the door after this very sad thing of having to say goodbye and bury somebody, or it was at the crematorium. So they have changed.
Church of Scotland Minister Elizabeth Spence talking to BBC Radio this week. Holly, what's the story?
So this week, Sky News presenter Colin Brazier sparked debate with an article in The Spectator in which he said he was ill at ease with a new trend of treating funerals as a celebration of life. His wife died earlier this month of cancer, and he's asked guests to leave their Hawaiian shirts and pink helium balloons at home and wear black for her funeral. His argument that it's unfair on children to insist that funerals should mean rejoicing. I just wonder if we've got to the point where we have to ask funeral guests to wear black, or is he leading a way for a return to that kind of sombre commemoration as opposed to a celebration of life? I
mean, my sense is we haven't got to the stage where we have to specify that mourners wear black. I mean, he's pointing to a trend that he thinks is concerning, isn't he, in saying that, there's this assumption that a funeral might be a celebration of life rather than a sombre affair. But I think the default, correct me if I'm wrong, does seem to be people assume a funeral is going to be a sombre affair unless someone says turn up in bright colours.
Quite interesting statistics, though. One survey found 54% wanted their funeral to be a celebration of life. 48% wanted favourite hobby, colour, football team or music incorporated into their funeral, which is quite different to years ago. We wouldn't have probably done that. Another one listed Monty Python's Always Look on the Bright Side of Life as their most popular song played at funerals. I think that's quite different to what it might have been maybe 10, 20 years ago.
Perhaps the very reference to Monty Python is pointing us at what this might be, Holden, which in a word is godlessness. Colin Brazier actually, really moving article he wrote for The Spectator, points out that he and his wife are Catholic. So actually there's no doubt about what a funeral is going to be. It's going to be a ritual mass. But actually, it's a lot of people who aren't religious think, well, what do I replace God with?
Yeah, and I think that can actually lead to real difficulties around how you conduct funerals. The two funerals I've been to have both been for grandparents, neither of whom was particularly religious. And in one case, it felt that it was handled quite badly, and the person who was conducting the funeral kept trying to elbow it in a way that was really awkward and just felt inconsiderate of what this event was meant to be about. But then it can be a difficult gap to fill, I think, because you are looking for something that gives more of a sense of the profound and of meaning beyond simply birth and death. But I think this sort of quandary might actually go back into religion itself. And Christianity, I think, has always been slightly divided about the way it deals with death, because it presents it both as the beginning of true life and eternal happiness, but also then fills itself with symbols of doom and, the sort of skull and the cross and the putting people into the earth. All of those feel quite doom laden, and the sort of very rituals of mourning are really quite contradictory.
Well, I mean, do you agree, Arian, that Colin Brace's assertion that actually kind of black is best for the mourners, at least, is right? And that seems a very personal thing to me.
There was an article in the Journal of Experimental Psychology that made the case that grieving rituals generally help people to cope by restoring a sense of control to them. What is taken away from you first and foremost when someone dies is any kind of control in what's happened. And I sort of looked at Brazier's article and his attempt to encourage people to have that formality in the funeral as his own bid for control. That what he was trying to do was say, this is how I would like it to be. I want it to be that kind of a commemoration. I'm not sure what my own attitude is to wearing black to a funeral. I do see his point that having a moment to reflect in a sober way is good, but I think that as a society we're a bit messed up with death generally, and something about that imposition of formality often shuts down people's willingness and ability to talk about people who have died in a way that I think is a bit unhealthy. I think you feel like sometimes you're at a funeral and this is your last chance to talk about this person, because after that it's completely taboo and no one wants to mention them again. So I'm very mixed on it. I get his point, but I wish we could all talk about the dead a bit more openly.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because he also talks in the article, doesn't he, Holly, about the pressure that he feels to give a memorial speech, and how he's saying basically, look, this is my wife. We've had 6 children together. I won't be able to get through that. I'm quite happy for the priest to do that for me, but he feels the pressure of people expecting him to publicly emote.
Yeah, which I think is quite a new thing for him to even feel that expectation. And I imagine that's not very nice when you're already mourning for somebody to feel like he's not mourning enough by doing a eulogy. But it's not for everybody. I've seen some amazing eulogies by close relatives, but it's not for everybody. And I don't think everyone should expect that from them. But again, this is about expectations, and I do think everyone's different. And if his expectation is that you can't mourn properly wearing multicoloured clothes, I think lots of people would disagree with that as well.
I mean, it is so dependent on the person that died and the way that the mourners want to conduct things, isn't it? I mean, in this case, it's a younger woman who has died of cancer tragically young, and they leave behind 6 children who are going to be at the funeral. That's very different to someone who dies at 90 and specifically says, I want a colourful funeral.
Yeah, and also it's entirely cultural, as we've said. Around the world, funeral practices are entirely different. Jewish mourners can't shave their beards. Hindus tend to shave their heads and their beards. Crying in funerals is apparently considered disruptive to Tibetan Buddhists, whereas throughout plenty of cultures, actually crying is, if not expected, at least encouraged. So, the way that people mourn is entirely different.
Reminded me, actually, when I said I'd been to 2 funerals, that was fake news. There was a third while I was living in Tanzania.
They won't be listening.
While I was living in Tanzania, I was invited to a funeral of somebody who had been at the school I worked at. It was a village event, and it was something incredibly colourful, very raw as well. And the area I was in was nominally Christian, and sort of the day-to-day and week-to-week worship was, I would say, fairly conventionally Anglican. But then the funeral was an area where the sort of pre-colonial animalist religion came out. I'm not sure my grandma and her friends would have wanted that sort of approach, but it did feel like it was getting to the raw emotion of it in a way, going back to my earlier point of Christianity and its sort of its attempt to contain all of that rawness and almost to kind of prettify it. And then perhaps now when we're moving to post-Christian or post-religious sort of attitudes in a lot of parts of the country, there's even more of a disconnect between that sense of profanity. And I think for some people, they can find meaning in either kind of artistic approach where you sort of read passages that have meant something to people, you play music that have meant something to people, and that you can have a sort of celebration of life that doesn't have to be balloons and Hawaiian shirts, but it can reach towards art to give you that sense of connection to a broader world. But for other people, they need that sense of ritual and tradition to give some sort of consolation.
I mean, Holly, why do you think this piece in The Spectator really resonated with people?
It was obviously a personal piece and it was a very moving piece, and you can completely understand where he's coming from. Well, I could completely understand where he's coming from, even if I would probably disagree for my own funeral. I'd be quite happy if people want to party and get drunk and do it that way, because that is quite a British way of doing things, I think. You have a drink and then you let your feelings out, and maybe that's quite difficult to do if you're trying to be very sombre. And he's got 6 children. I mean, it's difficult to argue with him. He's the one having to deal with them day to day.
But I'd suggest it's not just that. I mean, I agree with you. It was a devastating article to read and you feel so sorry for him personally, but I think the reason actually it resonated as a subject is the British public, despite the trend that you highlight for more of these celebratory funerals and less religion in funerals, are uncomfortable with it and don't quite know what to do. Like perhaps they haven't had the closure they wanted from that kind of funeral. Perhaps then they're a bit unsettled that the traditions of old have been completely forgotten, but they also don't believe in God, so what do they do?
There is that trouble. If you come along thinking I've got to celebrate this person's life, but actually I want to sit down and have a really good cry, you probably feel like you don't want to. And if you're the very closest of family members, you're thinking, everyone else is happy. What do you do? And when do you have that emotion if not at a funeral?
But isn't the discomfort also just because we don't know what to do, and that is the purpose of ritual anyway, is to give you parameters and to first you stand here and then you do that, and it kind of at least gives you a template to work with. But I think people feel weird about going to funerals, whether they're cheery or they're depressing or somber, because it's a horrible thing to have to do.
Right, well, I'm now thinking about funerals. I'm sure, Holden, you'll cheer us up with your story. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Well, just for a change, I've found something to cross off your list of worries.
The early symptoms of the disease, fever, weakness, muscle pain, headache, and sore throat, are often mistaken for the flu, malaria, typhoid fever, or dysentery. But then things get worse. Vomiting, bloody diarrhea, often internal and external bleeding, skin rashes, and purple spots on the skin. Once the symptoms set in, the person is contagious and has 6 to 16 days to either beat the virus or die. The death rate, high, 50 to 90% chance of death depending on the strain and access to medical care.
Yeah, thanks, Holden. I feel much better now. That was Miguel Marquez on CNN outlining the messy truth about Ebola. You can find the whole video on their YouTube channel. Okay, so what's the story, Holden? Is Ebola back?
It was back, and now it's gone again. And actually, the reason I selected this story was, I think, compared with a few years ago when there was a much larger Ebola outbreak, that got a huge amount of attention, and rightly so. Although I think some people would suggest that perhaps there was rather more hype than information there. But this time it feels we've gone to the opposite end of the scale. And the World Health Organization declared this week that the outbreak in Democratic Republic of Congo had come to an end. But I'm not sure that most people were even aware that the outbreak had started there in May.
How many lives did it claim?
It claimed 33 lives. That is much, much lower than the death toll from the West African outbreak between 2014 and 16. That killed about 11,000 people. So clearly this was a smaller outbreak. It was controlled more quickly. But that was actually the other reason I wanted to bring it in, was it's not an accident, or it's not luck that this outbreak killed far fewer people. It was the world and Congo itself were much more prepared, and they followed all of the procedures that had been put in place after the last outbreak, and as a result, the death toll was that much lower.
And why don't people want to read this good news story, Holly?
I'm not
You want to
sure.
read that story, don't you?
It's such a good news story because of the challenges that it brought. I mean, everyone was more educated from the bigger outbreak that happened in 2014-16, but it was still really difficult. It was by the Congo River, which is essentially their transport highway, so it could have spread all through Central Africa, and there was some people that had Ebola in very remote parts of the country that was impossible to get through without being on foot or on motorbike. So it was really tricky to track those people down to actually vaccinate against them. So the fact that they've actually contained it is amazing. People, maybe they're just bored of hearing about Ebola because we talked about it so much in the recent years. It didn't get the coverage that it got in 2014, and maybe that idea that it's not spreading to the UK. I mean, it did come to the UK, US, Europe last time. It's our internal shutdown that we just don't care because it's a different
That's the horrible
country.
truth, isn't it, Arian? You know, I mean, of course we care for the people in West Africa that were dying of Ebola, but the subtext to that story was, and it's coming for us next.
The last time around.
And this time around, I mean, as we've discussed on this show before, there's so much going wrong in the Congo that actually you can't keep on top of it all anyway. And the feeling is, well, it's not going to affect my life.
I think it's a mix of both. I think there is a connection between the lack of interest in the average punter and the fact that it's not going to be a problem that afflicts that reader personally. But I think it is also something about what Holden and Holly mentioned, that readers are less interested in good news stories than they are in bad news stories. And why that is, I don't know. We'd probably need to get a psychologist onto this show, but it certainly is the case, you know, that when we sit down and have our morning news meeting every morning, we're largely talking about the news stories that are bad news, or actually quirky news, like when people paint a donkey to look like a zebra. But by and large, people are more interested
feeling
in
of a story
negativity.
you didn't just make up.
No, that's
what's
fine.
been on your mind this morning.
It's also what people are reading, actually.
What an insight into news gathering. Holden, is it also perhaps tied into fears of immigration, which again, as we discussed on the show recently, have changed recently, have dialed down slightly?
Could be, actually. I hadn't thought about that connection, but the last outbreak did coincide with the uptick in Mediterranean and North African migration. So at the same time that you had the images of the outbreak in West Africa, you also had images of people trying to get across the Mediterranean from Libya. So perhaps those two things did connect. And there was that feeling that the barrier between the outbreak and London was very much narrower. That may have been a false judgment, actually, in this case. The World Health Organization in May was very worried about the recent outbreak because there was a confirmed case in a city of 1 million people which had air links to Kinshasa, and Kinshasa is then fairly well connected to certainly the African aviation network. And because Ebola has a 21-day incubation period, this is why it causes such alarm to the UN and the WHO, because it would be possible for an infected person to travel a very long way. Although the earlier outbreak in West Africa did kill 11,000 people, that was still seen as the world was fortunate that they were mostly in remote areas which didn't have that sort of interconnected relationship with the rest of the world.
I wonder if there's also an element that people do get really excited when there's lots of deaths and they're kind of gruesome. It's this internal bleeding, it's these horrible stories that you're kind of compelled to read. But there's also quite a lot of repercussions from the Ebola outbreak that's still happening today that everybody just ignores, and there's no money invested in it. Like in Sierra Leone, people were put off going to hospitals and getting health advice because that's where they were catching Ebola in the first instances. So they became these areas that you just wouldn't go to. So nobody was kind of getting any help from doctors for other problems. There was a big rise in teenage pregnancies. People weren't getting birth control. So there's all these maternal mortality rates have gone up. There's loads of other issues that have come from it, but no one's really interested in that side of things because it hasn't got the big headline grabbing symptoms that Ebola had.
And also there's a lot of conspiracies about vaccines around, aren't there? Let's hear it for the vaccines here.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the reasons that this outbreak was controlled so much more quickly was that an experimental vaccine was made available. It's not licensed for use yet, but in such an emergency situation, it can be pressed into use. And 3,300 people were vaccinated in northern Congo. Anyone who had come into contact with any confirmed case was protected in it with a system which is called ring vaccination. So you essentially kind of create a cordon around the outbreak. And I think this is a really good example of the kind of incremental change for the better that happens constantly in the background in labs, in field work among health workers, even in the Congolese Ministry of Health, which is not praised often internationally, but is regarded as having done a really good job, been very transparent, welcomed in help, and made the most of it. It's easy to get distracted by the bad news stories or by somebody who's tweeted something that shouldn't have 5 years ago. But meanwhile, all of these little steps to make us safer are going on unknown.
And it's why it's also important to continue...
Hold on, this sounds like Arian's final thought. Make this a good one. This is why it's important to what, Arian?
I thought it was just a passing thought that could...
I wanted to end with look after
thoughts.
each other and yourselves.
I was going to say that I think that it's the reason why it's important to maintain focus on stories like this that are good news, because it's only between outbreaks that we're able to do things like continue to invest in and develop experimental vaccines like the one that was used to curb this outbreak. So I think that there is a reason why it's important to keep an eye on good news stories.
Look after each other and yourselves.
And if I may add a final thought. It's also, to tie us back to our first subject, it's a really good example of why we need to be open to learning from our mistakes.
Thank you. My thanks to Holden Frith, Arian McNichol and Holly Clements. That is it for this edition of The Week Unwrapped. Share your thoughts on today's show, so long as you don't say anything bad taste, lest you lose your job in 2028, on our SoundCloud page or at Week Unwrapped on Twitter, and you can write a review as well on Apple Podcasts. If you have time, that really helps others discover the show. Thank you. And stay subscribed to hear our next bonus edition of Business Unwrapped. That's our series of extra shows brought to you by our friends at Barclays Corporate Banking. You can get them all, the new shows and the bonus shows, delivered straight to your phone when you subscribe to The Week Unwrapped for free on your podcast app of choice. Until then, I've been Ollie Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.